Pilot boys in the building. Let's go.
Pilot boys, we get on up. We gon' fly, boys, we getting up.
You're listening to the Pilot Boys podcast. Our next guest is the lead writer for Monday Morning Quarterback, Sports Illustrated, and much more. Welcome to the show, Albert Breer.
Thanks for having me, Mecca. I appreciate it.
No problem, man. We're just going to jump right in, man. You have had a great career. You're still young, and I'm sure there's a lot more that you have left to do. There have been some, obviously, just like everybody else, there have been some ups and downs, some great things, some learning experiences. Yeah. And we wanted to kind of get the full breadth of that and kind of just get a little bit more about your story as we do this interview.
Yep, you got it.
And just wanted to talk about your start, how you got into sports journalism. When you decided that was going to be what you were going to pursue as a career.
Sure. I was the kid who I loved all sports growing up. And, like a lot of kids, I eventually came to the realization that I wasn't going to ever make a dollar playing any of the sports that I was playing growing up. Like we all kind of reached that realization at different points. And so, for me, it was sort of, it kind of happened by accident. There was a point in high school where my grades weren't very good, and I was kind of, I would say, a little bit of a jerk, and my dad recognized that. And, there were different ways that he went about trying to humble me a little bit. And one of them, he said, you need something for your college application. And so, he said, well, what do you think about trying to get into sports writing? And so, he called someone, and then one thing led to another, and so my junior year in high school, the newspaper in town, the Sudbury Town Crier, which was just a small town in Massachusetts, the town newspaper there, sports editor called me and said, how would you like to do write-ups for the football games, because I was playing on the team at the time and it was easy for me to do. And so I did those, and I guess I did a good enough job with those where he was like, how would you feel about going and covering a sport that you're not playing? So that winter, I covered the girls' basketball team. And one thing led to another. And, I started, I was making some money doing it. I think it was it was some $40-$50 an article, which when you're that age and back then, it was pretty good money. Yeah. So I kept doing it. And, like anything else, I think it's just, you recognize that something comes sort of naturally to you. And so, I kind of kept doing it. And then I wind up at school at Ohio State, and I can't imagine a more perfect place to learn how to cover, I cover sports because you're exposed to, sports that are quasi-professional, the men's basketball team and the football team there are really run like NFL and NBA teams. And so It's just sort of I guess it would start with, just loving sports growing up, playing sports growing up, and then, eventually, landing at something that that just, initially came naturally to me.
And how did you end up from coming from Sudbury to that decision to actually come to Ohio State?
Yeah, you guys are going to laugh about this because my dad went to Michigan.
Wow.
It's I'm a triple legacy at Michigan. My dad's from Detroit, and so I had a ton of Michigan and Michigan State alumni in my family. And so, yeah, I always thought I was going to go to a Big Ten school. And, if you're from out here, schools like that don't exist here. You know what I mean? We just don't have the big, it's just, UMass is UMass, but it's not like one of the schools out there. And so I always knew I wanted to go to a school like that. And I applied to 3 Big Ten schools, and I think a common friend of ours, Mecca, Eddie Brown, was a year older than me. And I played football with him in high school, and he was a really good player, was good enough to be a priority walk-on at Ohio State. And he just kind of kept talking to me about it, and it seemed good. And then I visited, and that was awesome. And yeah, it's just sort of one of those things where it was I knew I wanted to go to a Big Ten school, and so I applied to 3 of them, and I got into one of them, and that was the one I got into.
Nice.
So talk to us a little bit too about how you got to, obviously NFL Network, Sports Illustrated. How did you get into that from where you started?
Yeah, it was just sort of over time. I mean, it's like you just sort of chip away at it, and it took a couple breaks. I started when I got out of school. You sort of want things to happen fast, and they didn't happen fast for me. Like I was covering high schools for quite some time, and it was a great environment. As frustrating as it was when I saw other people my age that got to cover the pros. It was a really great environment for me to learn and for me to make mistakes, quite honestly, and you just sort of, you go along the way and you just sort of figure out how to do things right and wrong. And, I was at a great little paper. Like this is a very, very small paper, but, it was near where I grew up, the Metro West Daily News. And the two guys who'd come before me covering the Patriots, were excellent, and wound up at much bigger places. Tom Curran, who wound up at the Providence Journal and then NBC Sports, then Mike Reese, who wound up at the Boston Globes and at ESPN now. And it just, so happened that I watched the two of them while they covered the team. Then when Mike went to the Globe, I wound up getting the opportunity to cover the Patriots, did that for 2 years. And I applied for every job under the sun covering the NFL while I was doing that at bigger papers. And I couldn't get so much as an interview, and that was frustrating too.
Right.
But my dad had somebody who he grew up with, so his, I want to make sure I get this right. His, one of his best friends was cousins with Rick Gosselin, who was, the sports, was a NFL writer a long time at the Dallas Morning News. And, basically I saw a job up there. I was so close to leaving the industry. I had taken the LSAT. I was, it's just, you can only make, I'm making like $30,000 a year. I'm 26, 27 at this point. Eventually, like you're like, all right, like I got to do something else.
Right.
And so my dad said, well, I know this guy. He's like, through somebody else, maybe I can give him a call. And, he and I talk, and, he just says, okay, just instead of sending me your clips, instead of sending the clips to the office, why don't you just send them to me and I'll walk them in and put them on the sports editor's desk. So that was step one for me.
Yeah.
And then step two, I haven't told this story very many places publicly.
Okay.
Bill Belichick wound up writing me a letter of recommendation, which I didn't ask for. But I talked to, a couple of people around him about what I was doing and how I was applying for this job. And so I got a call from the sports editor one day, and, he said, you won't believe what I got. And I'm like, what? And he's like, it's a letter of recommendation from Bill Belichick. Wow. And that's so
a game changer right there.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's what I always appreciated about Bill was like, I was a nobody kid at this small suburban paper. And I guess I'd done enough in 2 years, and, he wrote the letter of recommendation. And then I think once you get to like the point where, I'm covering the Cowboys at the Dallas Morning News. Once you get to that point, like now, like it's just sort of like a matter of competing against, whoever you're up against. Because once you get to like the point where you're like on a high profile paper covering a big beat like the Cowboys, I just feel like if you do a good enough job, you'll find your way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's an amazing story about Bill Belichick. And, most people see him as kind of like this kind of mean guy, but I've had a couple friends have played with him, and it seems like once you see the personal side of him, he is a pretty good guy and is pretty supportive of many people behind him.
I just tell you, I can remember an interaction I had with him, and this is when I came back and when I was the Sporting News after I'd left Dallas, and I was working on a big cover story on Bill, and it was like this Q&A that I did with him. And I remember somebody said to me like he's like William Carnegie, and William Carnegie, the whole thing was like, I had the whole thing thought out in my head, but I didn't think like he wouldn't like understand what I was saying. So he's like Carnegie, huh? He's like, what do you mean? And so I said, well, I heard Carnegie was like this guy who, like I've heard Carnegie was like this guy who was like really, really hard to work for, right? Like tough, like unbending, like very old school and difficult to work for. But then outside of work was like a great philanthropist, a great family man, very warm to his friends. And so I said, that's what I mean, Bill. And he didn't directly respond to that. Like, he didn't directly answer the question. He just said, "Huh." It's like, well, being compared to Carnegie is pretty flattering. So I think that's like a big part of who he is, is that he's very good at compartmentalizing his life.
Right. Talk to us a little bit too about Dallas, covering Dallas. There's just so much media around that team, and obviously they've had years of success and years of hopes and failed dreams. But talk to us about what that was like, kind of that period of time when you're down there.
Yeah, it's a different world. It was for me, going from covering New England, which was like it. I guess the best way to describe it was like going from like journalism Siberia to journalism Cancun. You know what I mean? Like where you go from having to fight for every little piece to now all of a sudden everybody's in this environment where everything's in front of you. And for me, it was interesting because, I think people who'd work in an environment like New England, you would look at it and you would say, okay, I would love to have somebody swing the doors open and hand me access to everything. That's a double-edged sword, because you go from you have to fight for every scrap to now, you're looking over your shoulder constantly because the next guy's getting something too. If you're competitive. It's like you go from everybody's kind of scrapping for whatever they can get to now it's like everybody's a lot of people are getting a lot of different stuff, and you've got to compete and try to beat all of them. And so it was great for me in that it was like two very different environments. And, you go from a place where, Bill had that whole, it was and it's from Parcells, was the whole one voice thing. Like everything flows through me, one voice, to, Dallas, where it was almost I think 6 or 7 different players had their own radio shows and the owners available in the locker room after games. Yeah. And it was definitely like a culture shock going from one to the other. But it was awesome for me because I got to see two very, very different ways of doing things. So I think now when I cover the league, it's like, I'm not really caught off guard by anything I see because I saw two very different ways of doing things.
Right.
And so you transitioned from Dallas to SI. Is that correct?
No, I went from Dallas. So I went from Dallas to, this was like the transitional phase of my career. Dallas to the Sporting News to the Boston Globe, where I was, the NFL writer, the national NFL writer there. And then in 2010, I went from the Globe to NFL Network. And I was at the NFL Network for 5.5 years. And I've been at SI since, which is a little over 4 years now.
Wow.
Right. So let's transition a little bit too. So we, your name has been in the news recently, not necessarily maybe for reasons that you might hope so, but recently the Red Sox came out and essentially acknowledged that racist incidents have happened in their stadium. Torrey Hunter had spoken on it, I think years back, maybe in 2017. Adam Jones initially had spoken on it, and your response to it was, "Look, I've been to 200 games basically in Boston. And I've never seen that." And obviously, you caught backlash from that. And now that's come back up again, people brought your name back up. And so I have a couple questions about it. One, and I'm just going to be honest, when I first heard it, I had a very visceral reaction to it, right? Because I've, being Black and understanding racism and how racism works and being through a ton of those same incidents in many different cities myself, I was like, I don't want to have the onus of proof to have to be on me.
Right.
That's just not even a fair kind of analysis. And so I know that you've talked to a lot of people since this, including my friend Eddie and other people, and you've gotten some probably renewed perspective. I'm curious to know kind of what that renewed perspective is, what some of those conversations look like, and what your perspective is on it today.
Well, if you guys are okay with it, I'll go back to the start, like how this sort of all began. I mean, I'm very proud of where I grew up. I think where I grew up gave me really great perspective. And I think like Eddie would back me up on that. We lived in a bubble is the best way to put it. And, it was very like where we went to school was, I think the town we lived in was very, I would say very progressive, very educated. Like most people came from educated backgrounds. The school was a really good public school, but it was more diverse than most public schools. That there was the METCO program there, so we went to school with a lot of kids from the inner city. And, I think like where I grew up fooled me into thinking that racism was a thing of the past. Like, because we like when I was 15, 16, 17 years old, we didn't look at each other that way. We just didn't. And like, I mean, like, it's on me for not seeing past that. But then I went to school in Ohio and I saw racism, and I went to, I lived in New Jersey and I saw racism, and I lived in Texas and I saw racism. And, I was fooled into thinking like that. And again, this is on me, like that, like, that, like, I like where I grew up wasn't that way, and, when I said what I said, it was sort of like, I would say this, I would say I was trying to stick up for my classmates and my teachers and the parents, the good people the good parents that were, around where I grew up. And, I didn't really take into account what other people's experiences were. And so I thought, like, I pride myself on being loyal to the people that I grew up with and being loyal to the people that I've been around and my friends and my family and everything else. And, I really kind of thought to myself, like, it's unfair that, like, these good people are being painted with this brush. And, it's a very selfish point of view, like very much like just my experience is everybody's experience. But that was my mindset. And, so when I said what I said, I got a lot of really good, pushback from a lot of the guys I grew up with, where they were like, you didn't see this, and you didn't see this, and you didn't see this. And like, we shielded you from this. And I didn't know it. I just didn't, I didn't understand what they were shielding us from, what some of the guys I grew up with were shielding us from. And I was like, oh God, I made I just thought about the mistake that I'd made. And, Mecca, the other thing is, like, you mentioned how visceral your response was. The other thing I didn't understand was how offensive it was to ask for proof. Like, I had no idea. Like, I was just like my mindset was like, before you paint everybody with such a broad brush, can we see something? And that was a total wrong way to look at it, because I just didn't understand. I didn't get, like, that the other side of that was that, like, oftentimes people like there's a history of not believing people when they, like, I just didn't and I wish I had a better understanding of that then, but I didn't understand like that part of it. And when I heard it from my friends, who, I mean, like, thank God I've got good, like, honest friends who are willing to confront me about stuff. And I got confronted about it.
Yeah.
And, after that, like, and I'm really sorry for what I said. Like, I shouldn't have said it. Like, I was wrong. And, after, like, sort of, when we got through that, I knew there would probably come a time when I would address it, but I just didn't want to make it about me. That was the other. That's like why, like, honestly, Mecca, like, that's why I'm like, I was even hesitant to come, like, why I had to think about coming on with you. And I'm always happy to talk with whoever about this stuff. But I never want to, like, I don't want to make this about me. It's not about me. Like, I learned, and all I did was get to the right place. You know what I mean? That's I don't deserve credit for that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Well, I think
I wanted to actually talk about that a little bit. You mentioned the bubble that you grew up in, right? And you've been a journalist and you've covered Boston sports for an extensive period of time, right?
Yeah.
It seems like this is something that, if you speak to enough journalists, you speak to enough athletes, it surprises everyone a little bit, because Boston is known as kind of this East Coast liberal place, right? But there is a really, really dark underbelly of racism in that city that it seems like, just like a lot of people who are from there, they don't want to acknowledge it, right? They don't want to acknowledge that this is happening in Boston, but history and experiences, the wide range of people show differently, right? Why do you think that is? Why is it so hard for people specifically from Boston to acknowledge that racism exists at the level it exists in that town?
Because I think that there are, I would tell you that there are, the history of Boston, it's been in a changing and evolving city. And, like, I think it's like we read about like like the bus riots in the 70s, like, right. And I might have the date wrong. It might have been late 60s, 70s, whatever. We read about that. And, I think that there was this feeling that like Boston had gotten past that, and that like a lot of the things that you saw in the 70s, and this is where I think my perception got a little warped, was like my perception was we read about the stuff that happened, and it was like reading about Whitey Bulger. You know what I mean? Like it was like old school Southie, old school North End, like Goodwill Hunting, like was like that's a thing of the past. And if you've been in Boston, like you go in now and you see, and it's like the North End's not really the Italian neighborhood anymore. It's like young professionals and it's gentrified. Southie, same thing. Like Southie, like I think like Whitey Bulger's old bar, Triple O's, is a yoga studio now. Like it's a different city than it was, And so, I think in a certain way, what I would tell you is like that we all had like, I think like a lot of us growing up there, especially people who didn't have roots there. And I didn't, like, my mom's from Austria. My dad's from Detroit. Mm-hmm. Like I didn't have my parents moved there. Like I grew up there, but like I didn't have any roots there at all. Like, and like a lot of like people I grew up with were the same. Like it was just sort of seen as like, oh, that's old Boston, and, even when I got to college, it's like, well, why don't you have that accent? It's like, well, nobody I grew up with has that accent, and it was just like sort of seen that way. It's like, yeah, that's what Boston used to be like, but it's not like that anymore. And I think that was why, that's why it's become, why it has become such a sensitive thing, is because I think there are a lot of people who grew up in Boston, like I grew up in Boston, and we're in these little bubbles where it's affluent and it's educated and it's very liberal and left wing. And, you sort of think to yourself, well, wait a second, like this is like there wasn't a single county in Massachusetts that voted for Donald Trump. That's true. Like there wasn't a single county in Massachusetts so, you all have your perception of what Massachusetts is, and it can fool you into thinking that what it used to be doesn't exist anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And one of the things that you said earlier about not making this about yourself, and I understand that, but I do think, though, that these conversations are important, particularly when, we have the type of platforms that we have. And obviously you have a very huge platform, right? And then also when things go, you can't necessarily control what goes public and what becomes a huge story, but this is one of those things. So I think it provides a great opportunity for us, right? People like us to kind of talk through it and educate the public, right, on, people who may think the same way that you thought at that time, and educate them on what we've learned and what we can do to kind of move forward, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the reason why we wanted to have you on the show. It's not to let's bash Albert Breer, right? That's not productive. It's how do we use these situations as potentially learning moments and teaching moments for people who are listening and the next generation. So I guess the last question I have on this is kind of that, which is, what is it specifically that you feel like you've learned or come to understand now that you feel like maybe you didn't understand before, and things that maybe you could do going forward to kind of champion or push forward some of those new ideas?
I think it's one word, Mecca. It's empathy. It's like, and I explained this in one of my columns a couple of weeks ago. It's, when I turned on the TV, this was probably 2-3 weeks ago, and there's a burning car on the TV, and my son's 5 years old. I got 3 kids. He's the oldest. And he sees it, and he's a 5-year-old boy, so he thinks fire is cool. So he like up at it and like what's that, Dad? What's that?
Right.
And I shut the TV off, and I'm like, it's not good, buddy. And my first thought was like how much more complicated that conversation is for some of my friends. Like how tough that conversation is, and how they're immediately thinking where that goes. And I talk with I was texting with Richard Sherman later in the weekend. That became part of the column too. And I mentioned it to him, and he's like, we don't think about it. He's like, that's a conversation that you're preparing your whole life to have with your kids. Like you're preparing your whole life to have that conversation with your kids, because you're going to have it because you went through it yourself.
Yep.
And then I think about like, I think about like, some of the stuff my mom said, when I was a kid, and she was like, it's not easy for so-and-so in town. And, I just sort of thought like, she's like, it's like you think about like some of the things that I didn't really, because of my own experience and because of the people around me, because we had it good. Like you don't think about like, all right, like, well, this person's experience is different. And I know that sounds weird that like I'd have like that sort of awakening in my late 30s because I did feel that way towards people. But I think going through that like helped me see it on a different level because I was called out and I needed to be called out because I was wrong about some of those things. And it's like, for me, it was just, like, I don't know, it's just understanding like how, fundamental how ingrained some of this stuff is that you don't even think about, you know what I mean? Like, and it's just, I don't know. I think for me, it was like, I'm going to listen. Like, I'm just, like I said, this isn't about me. Like, I'm going to listen. Like, and I'm going to be better. Like, I'm going to be like, again, it's not about me, but I'm going to be better for it. And if I listen, maybe the next guy will listen. And if I'm willing to kind of express my opinion, then, that, and say that I did listen, then maybe the next guy will listen. And I had, like I said, like I put something up on Facebook. This was probably, 10, 11 days ago. I just felt like the time was right to kind of explain myself there because I again, like I struggle with like when I was going to say something, and I just, I decided to put something up on Facebook, and it was just for my friends, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I like that was the only intention of it, but I explained, a bunch of stuff in there. And, a good friend of mine who I'd worked with at SI, Robert Klemko, who's at the Washington Post now, said, you really should share this publicly. You should screenshot this and you should put it out there on Twitter and, like once and for all. And I was like, that's just making it about me too much. So he's like, well, at least put it somewhere in your column. And so I said, okay, like I put it in my column, and I figured if it wasn't under a screaming headline, then, I'm putting it in there. So it's on the record, and like my thoughts are there. And like maybe, 5 people read that and 5 people change because of it. And that's worth it, because that was his whole point, was people can learn from that, from you saying that. And so, I mean, as luck would have it, like, the Torrey Hunter revelation came out a few days later. So I had that to kind of show people where I didn't have to answer every single question, where I could just say, listen, this is my experience. And, this is sort of how I had to learn. And it wasn't that I didn't know how to listen. It was that I had to learn to listen better. Like I wasn't that I wasn't willing to listen. It wasn't that I had the wrong thoughts. It was just I had to learn to listen better. And I feel like I did learn to listen better going through that.
Yeah.
And not to transition from one controversial subject to another, but I think it's very important that we talk about this, right? Because with the Monday Morning QB, you have one of the most powerful media platforms in the NFL, right? And one of the biggest stories of the last few years has obviously been surrounding Colin Kaepernick, and how the NFL has kind of handled his protest. And it's particularly pressing now because it seems like the NFL now is kind of doing a complete 180 in terms of their position and their stance. You're hearing more from owners. Roger Goodell actually came out and said something about it yesterday, I believe. What do you think triggered the change? And then also, it seems like your position has shifted a bit on this. That's one part of it. And then the second part of it is I've been trying to get an understanding myself of where things got lost in translation between what Kaepernick was saying was the purpose of his protests to what it seemed like a lot of people digested and believed his protest to be about, which was disrespecting the flag, right? Which it never was about. But it seems like once that got put out into the atmosphere, that everyone kind of jumped on that, and he kind of became a bad guy because they thought he was disrespecting the flag, which was never really his purpose or intent in the first place. And I feel like a lot of journalists dropped the ball in that situation in trying to provide the proper context. And that's kind of what led to a lot of the division in our country around this topic.
Yeah, and I think that it happened in an election year probably had an effect too, and that and that Donald Trump running for president at the time was able to use it as a red meat like sort of topic for his base. I think that was probably a part of it. Look, I think that the way that whole thing happened, it was. You have Colin Kaepernick, the football player over here. You had Colin Kaepernick, the activist over here. And I think that it was hard to back then. Like, I think, there was just too much like trying to look at it in a straight line when it wasn't a straight line thing. And so, I think that it was so worthy of conversation and for people to talk about it. But like everything else, like you said, V, it was like, all right, so like, how do we draw a line in the sand and everybody's on one side or everybody's on the other? And, it sort of turned into, on one side, it was a protest against police brutality. And then on the other side, it was an offense to the flag. And it was just, I don't think that there was enough conversation back then. It just sort of got to, it turned into something else very quickly. And I think a big part of that was that it became, part of the discussion during the election cycle. And so there were a lot of different discussions to have within that, within the whole idea of the protest as it evolved over the course of that year. But it just seemed like there were too many people that weren't interested in having the conversation. And I'm glad we're having the conversation now. But it just turned into, should he be kneeling or should he not be kneeling? And I don't think that was Colin's intent. Like, Colin's intent was to start a conversation on police brutality. Instead, it sort of got away from him where it just became about whether he should be kneeling or whether he shouldn't be kneeling. And I think that was sort of the problem, was that it became about something that it wasn't about to begin with.
And how do you feel like the owners handled it at that time versus how they're handling it now?
Well, I think I would tell you that I think that the owners are very aware of public perception, and I think it's much easier for them to say something in support of Colin Kaepernick now than it was back then. And so I think you will hear more owners speak out, and some already have. Like Steve Bisciotti, Jed York. Like there have been, and Jed maybe less so because he was the Niners owner. But we have heard some owners, speak out in this subject, and it's easier for them to speak out now. Their handling of it back then, I would just tell you that there were a lot of football people who didn't even feel like they were like, I'm not like I don't even want to bring it to my owner because that's going to cause a problem for me, right? Like a GM or a coach or whatever. And so I think, it was 32 individual decisions, and to a varying degree, football, the anthem protest, like in some places, it was like, I can tell you, there were some teams where it just wasn't going to happen. Like the football people could go in and say, I want to sign this guy, and it wasn't going to happen. There were other places where you could have gone to the owner and made a case for it, but the football people just, for one reason or another, didn't do it. And so, I think it was different from team to team, and I don't think there was like a unified stance from all the owners on it. But when it came to the anthem protest, then that became a matter of business for them. Mm-hmm. And, then the concern was, it's an election year, our ratings are down a little bit. And so that's where it's sort of like, to me, from a league standpoint, it sort of spiraled into being something that I don't think Colin or Eric Reed or Kenny Stills or any of the guys who were involved intended it to be to begin with.
It's interesting. You said something that you said that I want to address too, is when you said there was like 32 individual decisions. And I think that theoretically that is true. Yeah. But I do think that when 32 people are kind of essentially making the same decision for the same reasons, really generally the same reasons. I mean, I know there's some football differences, but for the most part, like you said, they thought it was bad for business, right? And that was really I think the prevailing view from most of the owners. Then it essentially doesn't really become an individual decision, especially when you kind of have a monopoly on that space, right? Yeah. Now, if they're like, 5 other leagues like this that you're competing with, then that's different. So I agree with you that, they didn't necessarily all get in a room and say, hey, we're not signing Colin Kaepernick, right? Mm-hmm. But where I think it's important to paint this particular picture is that he was boxed out essentially for the same reasons, which is that they didn't want to deal with the fallout.
Right.
And individually at different levels, maybe there's a more willingness here, a little bit more less willingness here, but for the most part, that's essentially what it was. And that's why I think they ended up settling with him with the collusion case,
Right.
not necessarily because they thought they would win or lose, but because that is essentially what the argument is. It's like you don't all.
Oh, well, he had some. I trust me on this too. Like he had some stuff they didn't want out there.
Oh,
like,
for
that's
sure.
part of what he settled too.
Yeah.
Like, and I like that. That's the way the law works a lot. But like,
Right.
you know, through discovery, like he had some stuff that
Heck
they were
yeah.
willing to write checks to make sure that that stuff stayed where it was.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as you view it this coming this season, how do you feel like this season is going to go? You have, you know, JJ Watt, you know, being vocal about it. Baker Mayfield saying he's going to kneel. I mean, white players who are now saying, look, we're kneeling this year. How do you feel like that's going to play just with your kind of overall sense of fans and the league itself? How do you feel like that's going to play out?
I think a lot of people are going to be kneeling. Like I remember, was this opening weekend in 2017 after Trump made the comment? It might not have been the opening weekend, but it was when Trump made the comment, the sons of bitches comment. And I think that was because that wasn't the election year. That was 17. That was the year after.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was like maybe week 2 or week 3. And you had a massive amount of guys kneeling. And I think you'll see that at least the beginning of the year. I think the fact that there won't be fans in the stands, at least in some places, might actually wind up in a weird way helping the league. If you know what I'm saying, like you won't have the optics of, you know, boo, like if there are boos in a stadium, you're going to hear them. So because like a lot of these, some of these stadiums are going to be empty, like you may not need to deal with that quite as much.
Right.
And then I think I think going forward, it sucks, but like a lot of this is like probably up to the president. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's probably like how much of an issue does this become? It may be like, it may come down like this is, I can't believe we're here in 2020. It may come down to his Twitter account, right? Like,
right.
Like, I mean, like that's what it might come down to as far as the reaction from different people. You know, I think like most rational people are accepting of it and understand what it is now. I mean, you know, anybody like I've talked to Nate Boyer a bunch about this, and he the most incredible thing about the whole thing is that like it was a Green Beret that advised Colin to do this. Like it was like a Green Beret. Like this isn't like huh?
That's the other thing I don't understand about this, right? Like kneeling is almost a universal sign of respect outside of this scenario.
Yeah.
In every instance, kneeling is a sign of respect. So we want to
make it something else, which some people have a vested interest in making it something else. But like, yeah, that was the thing about it was that, I mean, like Nate was very, and I've talked to Nate a bunch about this. Nate was like, he's been very much like no, like this is like he equated, I thought this was like a really good way to look at it. He equated it to having a kid, like the country to having a kid. Right. And he's like, are you going to, like, if your country is doing wrong, are you going to discipline it? Are you going to try to send it a message, or are you going to stand by and just let it happen? He's like, it might be more pleasant for you if you stand by and let it happen. But is that good parenting? No.
And so that's what I say. I say that about any relationship. To me, it's the same exact thing. It's just like every relationship has its issues, and are you going to deal with them, or are you just going to let them pass? And you know, the way your relationship gets better is you decide to deal with the issues. So yeah, I definitely understand that analogy.
Yeah, I mean, and I just thought like, so the fact that it was a Green Beret that advised him to do it this way, you know, and that part, like how quickly that got lost. Like that, and it's just, I mean, to me, it's like eventually you get to the point where it's probably about something else. I mean, like, and I hate to say that. I I don't like, again, like I don't want to paint huge groups of people with a broad brush, but it's like eventually, after this has been explained to you so many times, you know, like that this is not about the flag. This is not about soldiers. This is not about like, you know, because I think we all have respect for like good soldiers. You know what I mean? Like, I think we all have respect for them.
For sure.
Like it's like after that's explained so many times, you have to accept that for certain people, I guess it just has to be about something else.
Right.
Yeah, and you brought up the term earlier about being in your own bubble, right?
Yeah.
And I thought that was particularly interesting with someone like Drew Brees, right? Who's in a community like New Orleans, to still kind of be disconnected, even at this point, having the teammates that he's had in the locker room makes you realize that we do live in multiple different Americas where there are multiple different things that people see, multiple different things that people care about and make themselves aware of, right? And I think the flag is supposed to represent the United States of America. So as you said, if one person has an issue with the country, then it's an issue for all of us, right? And I think that sometimes we fail to see that and get caught up in our own bubble and the things that matter to us, our families, our friends. And with Drew Brees, that seemed like exactly what it was.
Yeah, and I think everybody has you have a certain point of view, on things, and like everybody sees the country through their own lens. And I mean, look, I would never tell, I wouldn't tell anybody. And this is my own background. This is my mom's history, really. I would never tell anybody how to interpret the flag or the anthem. I don't believe in forced ceremony. So I don't I just think it's sort of up to everybody how they interpret it. And if you go back and you look at what Drew said, it was he didn't directly say and you can almost see where he didn't directly say kneeling is disrespectful, but he implied it. Mm-hmm. And it was tone deaf of him not to realize what he was implying while he was saying it. And I think and I know this, a lot of his teammates said, dude, you aren't listening. You've had 3 or 4 years. You aren't listening.
Yeah.
And so I just think that there's a lot of times these things can kind of take on a life of their own. And I just think sometimes it's you get caught up in seeing everything through your own lens. And once you start to listen to other people, it can change things fast. There's no question about that.
Yeah. And I think we're seeing kind of changes all throughout society, not just in sports, but a lot more people are listening now than they were before. And that's a good thing. Hopefully we'll see it sustain.
Do you think Colin Kaepernick will be on an NFL roster this year?
Again, that's another one of those things that I don't think is so much a straight line thing. I think that there are a couple different factors. Number one, I've seen the NFL manufacture guys onto rosters before. It happened with Michael Sam, right? Where the league is worried about an image thing and they'll find a player a home, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's happened before. Mm-hmm. I would not be surprised if the league office wanted to do that with Colin Kaepernick, wanted to find him a home, because I think there are a lot of people who work there. There are people who work there who wanted him on a team 3 or 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So then the question becomes, if they do that, does Colin see it as patronizing? Does he look at it and say, well, this isn't a real job? And then it's okay, well, if a team wants to bring him in and there's no guarantee he's going to make the team, he might get cut at the end of August. He's got to go in and be a camp body and then have a shot at making the team. And we'll see on low money, is he willing to do that? And as a team want to bring him in, knowing if we cut him at the end of August, that could be a problem for us. And so that, to me, all the stuff that so much of the stuff that goes along with this is probably just a matter of how broken the trust has become between Colin and the league over the last 3 or 4 years. And so maybe you guys have ideas. I don't know how you get past that unless Colin Kaepernick is, personally willing to say, okay, I'm going to let bygones be bygones. If you manufacture a place on a team for me, I'm okay with that. And I'm all right, coming in for training camp and fighting for a job. And I mean, look, it's his right. If he sees something as patronizing or done for PR reasons, after all he's been through, he's got a right to look at it that way too, So I don't know. That's the part
I think he's ready to play. I think he, that's why he did that workout that he tried to do. Yeah. I think he's probably willing to accept maybe something that he wouldn't have been willing to accept a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. But one other interesting thing, and you probably have some insight on this too, that just if you take that out of it for a second, just the whole hoopla that comes with it, just strictly from a quarterback standpoint, I think he's obviously one of the best 64 quarterbacks in America. That's not a question. But the reality is that Cam Newton's not signed yet. I mean, you have a quarterback. People are pretty happy with their quarterback situation. across the board, which normally isn't really the case. Normally they're like half of the teams that kind of need a quarterback.
Yeah.
So I think that could play into it a little bit as well. Like you said, it's not really a straight line at this point, which is unfortunate, but they created that, but that's where we are.
The other thing is too, is like, I think like the job of starting quarterback and the job of backup quarterback, those are two very different jobs, you know? And so like, I'll give you guys an example. Like Derek Anderson at the end couldn't really play anymore. Right. But Cam Newton wanted him around in Carolina because he was a great resource to him. Right. It was great for him to have somebody experienced in the room with him.
Right.
And then like he wound up getting an extra year in Buffalo. And why did he get the extra year in Buffalo? Well, because Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane came from Carolina, saw how good Derek Anderson was for Cam Newton, and said he'd be good for Josh Allen. So they brought him there for a year. Josh McCown got the same sort of reputation.
Yeah.
And so he wound up, he extended his career by 5 or 6 years by being that guy.
Yeah.
And so like, I think that there's, you know, it's interesting. Like look at Denver, look at New England, look at Jacksonville. A lot of times like these teams would rather have the backup quarterback be a resource to their young guy than a threat to their young guy, you know? And you see that all the time where it's like, we're all in on developing this guy. And it's like, we don't want to put someone else in the room where, you know, if things go wrong for him in week 3, the entire locker room is going to want the other guy starting.
Right.
And so that complicates it too. Like, I think like, you know, honestly, that's why Jay Cutler wound up out of the league, because everybody, like, people thought he was a jerk, you know, so like it turned into like, you know, he gets cut by the Bears and then he just decides to go to Fox, he signed the deal to call games for Fox because nobody could, you know, look at him and say like, that guy can be my backup. And so what happened? Well, then Ryan Tannehill tears his ACL in camp and Jay Cutler signs with the Dolphins. So it's like those jobs are very different. Whereas like, you know, I think if a starter got hurt someone, people would be lining up for Cam Newton right now.
Yeah.
It's harder sometimes for teams to see those same guys as backups because they haven't seen it before.
I think there's obviously Colin needs to look at this rationally as well, right? Which is, I might have to take a backup job. You know, Jameis Winston had to take $1 million to be the backup with the Saints. Like, the market isn't great, but the first step is just getting yourself back on a team, back in a locker room, back in a culture. And if so long as he's willing to understand that and embrace that and isn't going in with the expectation of, I was one of the best quarterbacks before I left, I deserve that same place again. I don't see why he wouldn't end up somewhere as a backup, at least, as so long as he's willing to take on.
You know that worked out great for was Teddy Bridgewater. Like Teddy Bridgewater got hurt, not his fault, gets hurt. Like, you know, his career kind of went sideways. He said, okay, I'm going to go take 2 years. And I'm going to go learn in New Orleans. And I'm not going to be the starter in New Orleans. Drew Brees is the starter in New Orleans. Well, Drew gets hurt. He plays really well for 5 or 6 games that he gets in. Boom, he's making $21 million a year now as a starter in Carolina.
And so same thing with Michael Vick. Perfect.
Right.
Same thing with Mike Vick. He came in back as a backup, and you know, then he became a starter. And you know, he got his feet wet and learned, and you know, so there are opportunities for that. Yeah, it definitely can. One other question I want to ask before we let you out of here too about the season is, you know, so now it's been reported that Cowboys players, Texans players, including Zeke, which he was pissed about that was reported, they have COVID, right? And this is the middle of June, you know, and one of the things that's obviously unique about football is, and you play football too, so you know this, and at any level, is that you get in a huddle with guys. You're close to guys, not just the guys on your team, but even in tackling. And it's not a game where you can socially distance, so to speak, like baseball, right? Yeah. So it presents a unique level of challenges. And I guess, you know, we are kind of at a point in society where it's not that we don't expect people to get COVID. People are going to get it. The question kind of is, how do we manage it and what do we do with it when people do get it? So how do you see the season even being able to be played out? Are guys going to be like questionable on Thursday because they got COVID, you know, and it's like,
it's a mandatory. Is it like a 2-week injury if you get COVID?
And that's the thing. Like, I guess the standard is like 14-day quarantine. And then you got to test negative. I would think it'd be like something like that. And you got to test negative before you come back. I've I've talked to some people about the idea of like maybe they create a reserve list where teams can like just for this 1 year put guys who get it on a reserve list so they can bring in guys to replace them. I think it certainly stands to reason where you're going to have. I even heard this. Like I heard one team had talked about the idea of putting their 3 quarterbacks in 3 separate meeting rooms, and it sounds nuts, right? Like that sounds insane that you would do that. But if you really think about it, it's like, well, if one guy gets it, then the other 2 guys might get it. And if the other 2 guys, if all 3 quarterbacks get it, you are screwed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because now you're bringing in somebody off the street to start a quarterback for you on the fly. And as you know, like at that position, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So, like there's like all kinds of these questions where it's like, it's not just guys getting sick. Like I think and V, I think this is what you're hitting on. Like, it's not just guys getting sick. It's like guys testing positive who are asymptomatic, who you can't let back in the locker room because they could spread it to somebody else who might get sick.
Yeah. And you think about all of the potential fallout, right? Starting with the competitiveness of teams. Let's say Patrick Mahomes gets the virus right before the AFC Championship game, right? There's that impact. Then there's the fallout of on the business side. Everybody knows how big fantasy sports are in terms of the economy of the NFL, the impact there. It's just like there's so many things and concerns that are beyond control, right? You know that the injury risk is high in the NFL, but to have something like that, that's a perfect example. AFC Championship or Super Bowl, best player on the team is out not because he has a knee injury, but he tested positive for COVID, doesn't have any symptoms, is physically fine to play, but just has to. That's a unique scenario right there.
Yeah, there's no toughing it out. I mean, that's the thing. Like there's no grit in your teeth and going with it. If they're testing you, like again, like what the NFLPA was telling the agents on their call yesterday was every 3 days that they're going to get tested. So they're testing you every 3 days. Like they're gonna be cases. There's just are, because those locker rooms are no different than the rest of America, especially if you're not going to have the guys in a bubble. Like I know the NBA had planned to and the NHL had planned to. If you're not going to have guys in a bubble, like guys are going to go out and live their lives, and you're going to have cases. And so I haven't heard like a plan that I think, wow, that works. You know what I mean? Like I haven't heard something that doesn't just sound off the wall and crazy yet. And I mean, maybe they get there over the next month or so, but it's definitely going to be a different season. And, like the protocols look, like what John Harbaugh said, what is this, a week ago now? What John Harbaugh said, like a lot of coaches feel that way, like that it's just, you can't like the sport just you cannot like have normal social distancing rules and all that different stuff in a sport like football. It just doesn't work.
No, it doesn't. So we're going to ask you some couple fun questions totally off the subject before we let you out of here. First of all, thank you for joining us. Also, this has been really good. So our first question is this: who are your top 5 musicians of all time? The top 5 artists that get you going. So
this is going to be like. I think I got your text. Like I was actually like in a dentist chair when I got it because I had dentist appointment this afternoon. So I was like, God, like that's a tough one. So like of all time, I just sort of thought of different eras in my life. So so I wrote down from high school. I love Mobb Deep because we listened to it in the locker room before game. I love Mobb Deep and I love Biggie. And then that era, Dave Matthews Band was another one. So those 3, and that sounds like all over the place, right? So then Led Zeppelin was another. And so those 4. And like, I'm going to tell you guys, like my wife is so embarrassed that I like them, which I think everybody refers to as OAR, but why
would you be embarrassed? They're sweet, man.
Yeah. So I like that. Like she thinks it's really bad, but I love them because when I was in Columbus, like, so they were in school at Ohio State. They played like a bunch of parties that we went to when we were in college. Like they were there, and like so so that's got one that's got like a personal connection to me. And then my classic would be Sinatra. And one of the reasons why is that like first of all, he's like outrageously talented, but also like my wedding song was a Sinatra song, and so there's like like, I don't know, like there's just something about like, you're eating dinner or whatever, having some Sinatra on is nice.
Yeah.
Old Blue
So,
Line.
like I said, like I may be the only one. I'll
That's
listen.
nice. No,
Like,
that's
I give you
nice.
guys, if you ask for 5, Mobb Deep, Biggie, or Dave Matthews Band, Led Zeppelin, and Sinatra.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
Take it. That's a
I
great
love
list.
Yeah.
The second question is definitely more up your alley. Your top
Mhm.
5 athletes, and they can't all be from Boston.
Okay, so I'll have one from Boston on here. I do have, so I'll preface this by saying when I saw this, I sort of thought, okay, like this is like an in the moment thing, right? Like, so like, for example, like if I loved OJ growing up, I'm not going to say I didn't love him because, of what happened. Like obviously I think different than some people now, but yeah, so the athletes that I put down for when I was growing up, I always sort of liked the bad guy. And because, like I said, my dad's from Detroit, I really love the Bad Boy Pistons. So Isaiah Thomas is on my list. I have Steve Eiserman, similar reasons. My dad being from Detroit, like that was my guy in hockey.
Yeah.
Jim Kelly in football, I loved his toughness. Like I just, and I, when I was really young, I played a little quarterback. Wasn't, it didn't last all that long, but I love Jim Kelly for his
one of the more underappreciated quarterbacks, I think, even though he's a Hall of Famer. But.
Yeah, like, and I love the fact that he was recruited as a linebacker. You know what I mean? Like, I love the fact he was recruited to Penn State to play linebacker. So Jim Kelly, Steve Eiserman, Isaiah Thomas, Nomar Garciaparra is sort of an under the radar one now, but he was such a big star for like a short period of time. Like I loved him in the moment.
Yeah.
And then my fifth in the moment. And I think you guys might be, I just turned 40. You guys are around the same age as me.
Yeah, we're a little bit younger. Yep.
Okay.
We must have been at Ohio State at the same time. It's fine.
Probably. Yeah, I graduated in 02. Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
We graduated the same year.
Okay. So you guys will appreciate this one because this is like one guy I don't think the kids have a real appreciation for, Mike Tyson. Like when I was a little kid, I remember my dad waking me up. We were over, so we were visiting my mom's family over in Europe. And so I remember my dad waking me up at like 4 a.m. to watch Tyson Spinks. This is 88, right?
Yeah.
And it was like, this is the fight of the century. And I remember I loved watching Tyson fight, right? And it was like, and people don't remember, Michael Spinks was like this was like maybe like the first real guy who like this guy's got a shot to beat Tyson. Woke up at 4 a.m. I'm 8 years old, right? Like this is like, oh my God, like my dad would like, I can't believe my dad's letting me do this, all that different stuff. Knocked him out in 90 seconds.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I remember that like it was yesterday. That's
and I will not, like, I'll tell you what, like, I don't think anybody, I think it's very hard for people to understand the level of shock. Like, because when I say like the Buster Douglas thing was I still think it's the greatest upset of my lifetime in any sport.
Yeah.
The shock of that Mike Tyson lost to some guy, and maybe you'd heard of him because I know he's a Columbus guy and everything else. But like, how did he lose to Buster Douglas? And it was never the same after that.
No,
like, if you started watching Mike Tyson after 1990, you don't know who he was.
No, you don't. You don't.
Yeah, a lot of people say it coincides with Cuss dying. It's kind of where we lost.
Yeah, I remember hearing that. Yep. Yeah, but he was like, I mean, I don't know. Like I sort of like that's the other thing I don't think we have back yet. Like the build up for a big fight back then, like in the 80s, like it's not the same anymore as it was.
The other thing too is it's kind of like there's oversaturation of content now too. So that happens even with television shows and stuff like TGIF. I'm sure you were a TGIF guy.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It was Full House, Family Matters. What else?
Yeah, Boy Meets World.
Yeah, was Step by Step on that? Was that?
Yeah,
Step by Step. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was Friday night. You couldn't stream it. You couldn't watch it all the episodes in one day. You know what I mean? It was different. It was a different time period back then.
Had to watch it live. Like if you didn't, like I remember, like you get mad, like my kids get mad, like the internet goes out and it's like the world's coming to an end. Like I remember back in the day, like when you'd tape your shows and you'd be so pissed at your brother if he changed the channel, like after you
Right,
did the recording, and
right.
it'd be all set up, and then someone came in and changed the channel. Like,
So
yeah,
crazy.
so
Yeah, these kids are growing up in a totally different world.
no question.
But Albert, that's been great. This has been great, man. Thank you so much for joining us on the Pilot Boys podcast. This has been really good. Obviously, we're gonna keep watching you, supporting you. It was funny that we went to school, the same school, at the same time, didn't know each
Crazy.
other, didn't cross paths until today, really.
Yeah.
But I'm sure we'll continue to cross paths. So keep doing what you're doing.
All right. Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
All right, no problem. Take care, man.
Pilot Boys, we get on up.